Hello, Vape Village. Welcome to another discussion between me and Karis. I didn't know what to do for an intro then, Karis. I just kind of rolled into something a little bit awkward. But
No, I liked it.
here, Karis and I are in stage 4 lockdown, as are you all. We hope you're all doing okay out there. We were just talking about how we're both despite being very lucky in many respects, we're both struggling a little bit at the moment, and we really empathise with our whole VET community. We know a lot of students are doing it tough, and teachers, staff members at school doing it really tough at the moment. And our thoughts are definitely with you. Karis is stretched across 2 sort of virtual libraries at the moment, so it's a very strange time to be working in education. But we really wanted to bring you this session, which we've been planning for a little while, which is to talk about a range of texts that you might think about book listing. We know some of you have probably already finalised your book list for 2021, but time is completely meaningless now. So we're doing this anyway, and it's always good to be thinking about, I guess, the next set of texts that you might like to consider teaching in your school. So that's about our preamble, isn't it, Karis?
Yeah, I think that's it. Let's get into it.
Do you need an introduction? I mean, I'm the education officer at VATE. If you've forgotten who Karis is, she's a school librarian at both Prahran and Richmond High Schools. She's the Victorian branch president for the Children's Book Council of Australia. She's been a judge for their book award, so she brings a lot to the table for these discussions. And certainly when Karis and I worked together, this was one of our favourite topics to talk about, different books that would work in different contexts.
Exactly. Text selection is something that is really a passion of mine and something that I'm really excited to talk to VATE members about.
Absolutely. Probably the only preamble we need to give to this is that a lot of the texts we've chosen for today do have teachers' notes available for them, usually on the publisher's website for the book. It's usually organised through the publisher. Some of them also do have additional teachers' resources through the Reading Australia website, and I know Reading Australia are developing a whole suite of new resources at the moment. So some of these texts, I imagine, are on their radar as well. So you could keep an eye on that. We know that resources are a big factor in text selection choices. So we wanted to make sure you had some resources available.
Absolutely. And as a lot of the books that we're going to talk about today have been published either this year or last year. They're all pretty recent books, but I have had a look on publisher websites and I think pretty much all of them do have teachers' notes.
Absolutely. And again, if you are in a position now where your 2021 book list is already closed, these are books for you to read over the next 12 months. And I'm very certain that all of them will have additional teaching resources developed over that time period as well, because we know that they're going to work really well in classrooms. In beginning this session, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm recording today, the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, to extend my respect to elders past and present, and also to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which you are listening to this session as well. Obviously, one of the great features, I think, of this remote learning period has been a new engagement with people thinking about the traditional owners of the land on which they're working, which I think has been a really important thing to do. All right, Karis, we're going to start with years 7 and 8. It probably serves us to say as well that neither you nor I are really huge advocates of labelling books as particular year level text, but we've tried to level them out a little bit at an appropriate place, I guess, in the curriculum.
Exactly.
Yeah. With a bit of flexibility, we wanted to choose texts that would I guess have a low floor and enable all readers to access those texts, but also to have a high ceiling for those avid readers to really engage. I think you're going to kick us off, aren't you, Karis?
Yes, I am. I'm going to start with a fantastic Australian verse novel called Sister Heart by Sally Morgan. And as Ernest said, this one would be great at year 7 and 8. I think it would also work really nicely for EAL students, possibly at year 9 and 10. It is a verse novel, so it's not as intimidating to many students. There aren't as many words on the pages, and this would be really, really great for engaging students of ranging abilities. The reason for that is that for reluctant readers or readers of a lower literacy level, certainly accessibility there to get into this novel. but there are some deeper themes and narrative techniques that more advanced readers could certainly start to do some deeper thinking and deeper learning with. So it is a stolen generation narrative told in a very personal and authentic young voice of a young girl who is taken from her family in Western Australia. With that, there's definitely opportunities there for some cross-curricular learning, some fantastic opportunities to tie this text study into humanities units as well of First Nations history. And there are themes of kinship and the power of friendship, really strong imagery and symbols, a lot that you can draw out of this text for a text study. My sister, who's an English teacher in Western Australia, has been using this with her year 7s this year, and she said it has been one of the most successful text studies that she's done in her career so far. So that's a high recommendation from my sister as well.
Well, and I think it's great to hear when another teacher has had some success with a text, when it's landed with a cohort of students. It really, you can have an inkling about a text, but until you actually get it into the classroom, it can be difficult to know if it's going to work. You already touched on this, but I think verse novels are fantastic as well for straddling that bridge between poetry and prose. I think that a lot of teachers can be scared sometimes of teaching poetry in the classroom. They don't feel as confident about teaching it. And a verse novel can be a nice entry point for both staff and students to that world as well. And as you can see, it has won a litany of awards. I'm almost certain that there are resources for Sister Heart available through Reading Australia as well. Karis is nodding, which suggests that is probably true. So there's a lot there for you to draw on when you're teaching this text as well. So my choice is The Road to Winter by Mark Smith. I was struggling. I guess this age group is not necessarily my speciality in terms of text knowledge historically, until Karis pointed out that I was the one who suggested The Road to Winter for Richmond High School. And we had a lot of success with this text at Richmond High School, where we were working with it at a year 8 level. It was an Australian novel, first in a trilogy. Mark Smith is an English teacher by trade. And I think you can see that in the text. It is rich, a rich source of discussion. I really liked it for working with young people around the context of a text. I think that that can be a difficult skill set for them to develop, particularly in those early years of secondary school. But this has really rich context in talking about climate change policy in Australia, talking about refugee policy in Australia. I think it has a particular pertinence after this year's global pandemic. The premise of the text is that, a similar event has occurred, a pandemic has occurred worldwide. The protagonist is a teenage boy who has essentially to cobble together a life for himself. And it's about all of the people that he interacts with, as well as the broader political situation that he finds himself in.
One great thing about this book as well is that it's the first in a series. And I know at Richmond High, I obviously have multiple copies of this book, but I ended up having to buy multiple copies of book 2 and 3 because I had so many students come and want to extend their reading and continue the series.
And what was really interesting for me in teaching this text, the class I was working with had such a huge range of reading levels. I had learners who were basically reading at my reading level, which is not to denigrate my own reading level. I consider myself quite a competent reader, but these are basically children who started reading in the womb, I think, by themselves, not being read to, like there's something else, those kids. But there were also students who were really reluctant readers in the class, a number of students with disabilities who were reading at a prep grade 1 level. Obviously, we had to scaffold their learning with this text, but they were really engaged with it. And so I think it speaks really successfully to that wide range of readers. I think because of the use of imagery in the text, because it is thematically complex as well, looking at survival, and because I think that the majority of readers find the protagonist fairly relatable, it's rare, I think, that YA or middle grades books capture that voice really authentically. It can be really difficult, and I think that this text does that. So yeah, give it a read, try it out. Mark Smith is also available, I know, for a lot of author talks, which can be a really useful tool as well for engagement. What's your next choice, Paris?
My next one, look, there are so many fantastic Australian middle grade novels at the moment. It's almost hard to choose, but I did settle on The Peacock Detectives by Carly Nugent because it is an absolute favourite of mine. I haven't seen it be studied in schools yet, but I think it would absolutely make a really, really fantastic text study for year 7s or 8s. It is a heartfelt mystery novel that will appeal to a lot of different students. You can certainly hook a lot of students using that sort of suspense mystery story that is at the core of the book. However, what I really love about it is that it isn't just a straightforward mystery. It does weave in lots of different other aspects of storytelling and some really fantastic themes as well. The main character is really relatable. She's fantastic. She'll engage students really quickly, really strong voice, and really rich descriptions of place. The author lives in Bright in Victoria, and the book is set in that area. There are themes of complicated or unconventional families, the importance of friendship, and also storytelling, which I find is the most appealing thing about this book. The main character's father is an English teacher, a literature teacher. And so there's this really fantastic meta exploration of narrative techniques that the young character goes through with the help of her father, who's teaching her about things like inciting incidences and climaxes and resolutions, as well as some other storytelling techniques throughout the book. So it's a really great way to introduce some of those techniques to young students through a story that is engaging and relatable, and I don't think will be a burden to read. It is just a good book as well, you know, which is lovely that the author is able to combine that learning with an enjoyable narrative as well.
And I think, I know you and I have certainly had the discussion before about those middle grades, sort of the middle grades curriculum, I guess, where we're wanting to see students develop skills, but we don't want to be replicating a VCE text study at those early year levels. We want to actually engage students. And I think, the comment you made about it being actually just a good story and a good book, I think for me, it's that joy in reading that we're trying to capture and activate in years 7 and 8. And obviously you're striking a balance with that skill development, and you want text like this that will stretch and challenge readers. But ultimately, at year 7 and 8 as a head of English, and I know you in your role as librarian, we want them to love reading. Because if they don't love reading in year 7 and 8, it's going to be a long slog.
Exactly. And I think a lot of teachers and librarians do find that as students enter high school, it is a little bit harder to catch their attention with reading, and so you probably do want to be setting books that will be engaging and will be relatable, and as you say, just keep that joy of reading that they most likely already had in primary school, keep it up in those middle grade years.
And I certainly know in the schools I've taught in, I think we perhaps had a tendency to be a little bit conservative with our middle grades texts. They would stay on the curriculum for a really long time for a range of reasons, all of which were well-intentioned. But often they would be texts that kids had already read in the upper primary years. So I'm thinking of texts like I used the example with you the other day when we were emailing at Holes, which has hopefully fallen off most senior list now, but even Coraline, which I know is still book listed at a lot of schools, which, I would have 75% of my year 7 class having read Coraline in primary school. So I think it's important to continue to experiment with those texts to make sure you don't lose readers and to make sure you're still pushing them forward in terms of their skill development as well. Shall we talk years 9 and 10?
Let's do it.
I love the fiction that is available at the moment for years 9 and 10. Similar to what you said about middle grades literature in Australia, I think there are a plethora of really amazing authors writing for that middle grades and YA bracket at the moment, but they're not necessarily making it into the school curriculum. But I think we've got opportunity to do so. So let's talk about some of your choices here.
Absolutely. So as you said, I was a CBCA judge for the awards this year, and the 6 shortlisted books I would actually recommend any of those be put on a text selection list for 2021 and beyond. But in particular, Ghostbird by Lisa Fuller really stood out to me as a book that would work very, very well for year 9 and 10. It is a debut novel, which is very impressive, by a First Nations author, Lisa Fuller, and yes, shortlisted for the awards this year. It is speculative fiction. It's sort of mystery, suspense, horror, mashup, but it also ties in an exploration of the history and the culture, and in particular the family ties and the intergenerational bonds within an Indigenous community in Queensland. It tells a story of a young girl whose twin sister has gone missing under mysterious circumstances, and it's a very fast-paced adventure, really suspenseful and engaging. I think all my students that have already read this book have raved about it. I think it is going to be really popular, or is really popular. But the way that it covers some really, really pertinent themes would be fantastic for the classroom. It interrogates ideas of racism and small town prejudices, and then it also has some really impressive themes of identity and belonging. Overall, an absolutely stellar book that I would highly recommend. Again, this is one that has a lot that you can draw out from it for in the classroom, but it is also an engaging story that will keep your year 9s and 10s reading, which, you know, we said year 7 and 8, we've got to keep them reading. It's just as important in year 9 and 10 to keep them engaged with the library and with reading for pleasure.
And I think one of the dangers I've certainly felt as a head of department and as a classroom teacher at these 2 year levels, I mean, you're really starting to question whether you should be setting, I guess, adult texts like the texts that they will be studying at a VCE level. And I think, personally, I think I've come to the conclusion now, 10 years into my teaching career, that I think that's a mistake, because I think there is a lot of YA and middle grades work that from the 7 to 10 space can challenge readers while still engaging them. And I think so many times I've bored kids by setting something just thematically beyond them. Not that the literal comprehension was beyond them, but that it wasn't where they were at. And I think these rich works like Ghostbird and some of the other examples we're going to give can do all that work without boring kids, essentially, and without turning them off reading. And I think you and I have talked before about some of the students we've taught at Richmond High School who are avid readers and can read and comprehend adult work, but you know, things like the romantic relationships in those adult works, like they're just not where the kids are at because they're not adults, which I guess is why.
I mean, anecdotally, I've just seen books that, you know, things like 1984 or Macbeth or whatever, those sort of standard books, they're just not as successful with this age range. And I agree with you. I have sort of thought like that is the right thing to do for a long time, but I have come to realize that no, there are so many fantastic young adult books in particular that have young characters that might be set in Australia, that might be relatable in some way, but still have those deeper themes and those narrative techniques that you can use in the classroom. They're not short of those by any means.
And I think sorry.
No.
I think I cut you off. This Zoom problem. I was just going to say, I think developmentally, if we're thinking about them as learners, you know, that we're missing a phase if we throw them into that adult literary world too early. It doesn't mean certain readers won't be drawn to it, but I think as a set text, there's a lot to be said for this approach, which is going to bring me to a book that I bagged when you and I were dividing up what we were going to recommend. I've been raving about Metalfish Falling Snow for the last month or so. It's a debut text as well by Kath Moore, who has a varied background. She wrote in Growing Up African in Australia. She's also worked as a screenwriter and an educator in a range of contexts. To me, this is one of the most engaging books I've read all year. Traditionally, I am not a huge reader of YA. It's something I've really cultivated over the last few years of my career because I think it was a professional sort of deficiency. And I met Karis last year, who, you know, obviously tries to correct that in us all. But this book is just phenomenal. I think I've engaged with a few different English leaders around the state suggesting this. And I know some people have read it and said, oh, you know, is it too young? It's not too young. The protagonist, who's also the narrator of the text, is 14. I think has just the most unique voice that is captured just so phenomenally well by Kath Moore. It's really accessible, I think, for students, but there's so much there to analyze. I've been using it as my model text for the remote text study series of lessons, and I've really, really enjoyed modeling for young people how you can apply that literary analysis to this book. Deals with grief, it deals with family, identity, issues around racism, and there's just such a rich layer, particularly at the figurative level. In terms of its genre, it's, I basically sat it somewhere between a coming of age novel and a magic realist novel. It has these sort of subtle strands of magic realism. It's just a wonderful book to read, hugely engaging. I can't rave about it enough. We've actually got to have Kath Moore as a speaker at our state conference coming up. We're just huge fans. It's a hugely almost cinematic novel, and I think it started life as a screenplay. So I think that's where that comes from. But I know you've read it, Karis. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this book blew me away, and I have not heard a bad word about it. And like you, as soon as I read it, I just thought, I really hope this ends up on text selection, because it's a fantastic book for both engaging kids and looking at those, as you say, the symbolism and the magic realism. There's a lot to draw out from this book in the classroom.
Absolutely. And please, if you haven't listened to an interview with Kath Moore, there's a lot that's been put up online, ABC Radio, for example. She is a hugely engaging speaker as well, that I think her voice needs to find its way into the curriculum. Please, we're raving. What's your last selection?
My last selection is by one of the queens of YA in Australia, Vicky Wakefield. She is very well loved and very awarded as an author. But she writes really gritty, raw YA. I haven't seen it on a lot of text studies, maybe because of that reason. She definitely doesn't shy away from some pretty heavy topics. But look, young people are experiencing the things that the young people in her books are experiencing. And you and I have talked in the past about the importance of stories in order to help develop empathy and understanding, and for young people to put themselves in other people's shoes. And This Is How We Change the Ending is an absolutely fantastic example of that. As I said, Vicky Wakefield is a really creative and daring YA author, and this book is no different. It is a very real, often heartbreaking story. It has really, really fantastic character development. In particular, the main character, Nate, is exceptional. I don't understand how Vicky Wakefield does it. She gets into the mind of teenagers in a way I have not seen replicated in YA before. This is a book that would be perfect to engage, in particular, year 9s and 10s that are maybe a little bit more reluctant, that are really looking for something that they can relate to, something that feels like it is an adult's talking down to them. Just from the first chapter, I imagine so many would be hooked by this story. There are some really, really interesting themes of power, and in particular powerlessness, and that overarching feeling that a lot of teenagers have in terms of the control over their own lives. Also themes of courage, choice, and the importance of expression. The main character, Nate, is a poet. He writes poetry, but he keeps that a secret because he does try and put up a more typically Australian macho kind of front to his friends and family. As I said, there are some really heavy themes in here, heavy topics, including domestic violence. So that might be something to take into consideration. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, Ernest, but I think it's interesting that we do tend to get really scared when it comes to text selection and not want to put things on a list that have swear words in them or maybe cover some heavy topics. But yeah, it's an interesting one, maybe with parent permission. What do you think?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think, there's always a lot of fear around the idea of how carers will react to texts. I think in 10 years, I probably had 3 or 4 complaints about texts that I was able to very easily deal with. And I think, the fundamental argument that all of us who work with young people sort of rely on is this idea that we'd rather scaffold their experience with these complex themes and language and all of that sort of thing than have them. We know what they're watching on Netflix, etc. Without us there, it's better to engage it. And I think you obviously, depending on your context, you will need to have that discussion with your department and your school leadership. But I do think there's a lot of scope for text like this on a text list, because I think I would rather have to answer 2 or 3 parent complaints than have 70% of the class not read the book that we're studying. And I think that's where
So true.
sort of
You
where
put
I've
that
drawn the
so
line
well.
past. And I think we always fear it more than it ever eventuates. As long as you have that relationship, obviously, with your school leadership, that's an important conversation to have. But I think if we look at a lot of things that are on the VCE list, we can see that there's scope there for those challenging texts. And I think ultimately we bring the conversation back to the students. Like, is it a text that is important for students to read? And if so, I'm willing to have those battles with my school leadership or with the 1 or 2 parents who might complain about the text, because I think we've got evidence to back us up, and to win that debate. And I think, a voice like Vicky Wakefield's, it's interesting to me that we've chosen text for this, particularly this 9 and 10 bracket that have such strong voices, because I think readers at that age are drawn to that. And if they are hooked by the voice in the text, whether it's the narrator or whether it's the dialogue captured between different characters, that's the most important thing. All right. So we decided to tackle some texts for Year 11, EAL and English. Now, I know in my experience, our tendency was to drop down Year 12 texts that may have expired off the V-card text list to Year 11. But probably about 5 years into my career, I changed my approach to that when I was leading English departments, because I was always frustrated by elements of the text selection process at Year 12, and it's not time to get into a political discussion about text lists, but there's a lot of pressure put on the people who are selecting Year 12 text lists that, talk about forces at play there, and the pressure those people are under from the Herald Sun, etc. So I thought this Year 11 space was actually a place to book list text that would engage readers that I wanted them to read. And I used to always think about those young people who might not read another book after they finish school. I thought this Year 11 space was a chance to capture that. Again, I understand it's a resourcing question for a lot of departments, but one of the greatest experiences I ever had was book listing The Hate Race at a Year 11 level, and having some young people who were really reluctant readers literally run across a quite large school to discuss the text with each other after their English class. And The Hate Races, of course, ended up now on the VCE text list for 2022. So sometimes you can beat the slow-moving bureaucracy of text lists. That was a long preamble, wasn't it? Sorry about that. My first suggestion here is this year's Miles Franklin Award winner. There was a huge, a very, very strong shortlist for the Miles Franklin this year, and I contemplated putting Tony Birch's The White Girl on here as well. I think it would be an equally good choice at a Year 11 level. It's such a beautiful book. I think above all else, it's been lauded everywhere, from the Stella Prize to obviously winning the Miles Franklin, a huge range of other awards and shortlistings as part of that. It's just like Tara Jean Winch is a beautiful writer. Her prose is magical. The book deals with hugely complex themes around dispossession, colonisation, the impacts for First Nations people in Australia. But I think it's also a celebration in the text. It's a celebration of language. And a lot of the premise of the text is about the recovery of Indigenous languages in Australia, which obviously has a long history and is deeply interconnected with that history of dispossession. There's so much in this text for you to pick apart with young people. I think the structure of the text and the structure of the narrative is a really interesting starting point for that conversation, as well as the use of language and the reclamation of language in the text. Have you read Theo?
No, I actually haven't, but I mean, now I'm going to, based purely off that.
It's look. I think her work is phenomenal, and it's the White Girl would be another great book listing. But if you haven't read either of the texts, you should read both of them now.
Will, I promise.
That wasn't an instruction just to you, Gareth. It's okay.
No, you have great recommendations. I always follow them. So I'm actually really embarrassed to admit that I didn't know you could choose your own books at year 11 and 11 EAL. When you told me that this year, I was thrilled. So much opportunity for innovative new texts that you could choose this year and beyond. So one that immediately came to mind when we were talking about year 11 is A Constant Hum by Alice Bishop, which was published last year. It is a collection of short stories, some of them extremely short, as in 1 or 2 sentences long, almost microfiction, around the central theme of bushfires, in particular the Black Saturday bushfires in Victoria. So the stories are most of the time quite abstract. They're not survival stories of one character who beat the bushfire or who had somebody that passed away. They're not really specific stories. They are, it's literary fiction. It's very contemporary, and in a lot of the stories are quite challenging and unique, but I think the format allows for a bit more accessibility because, as I say, some of the stories are extremely short. You could just set several of the stories rather than the whole novel.
Absolutely.
Or look at several of the stories in greater detail rather than the entire book as a whole. This is one that I'd actually recommend all viewers to read. This is an incredible book, so impressive, and I think a must read for Australians. Obviously there are themes of survival and loss, but also themes of hope and redemption and some more positive stories in there. Of course, there are some really heavy themes, and this might be one that you need to think about as well. The imagery in it is incredibly strong, really vivid descriptions. I read a review that said that Alice Bishop has a forensic eye for detail, and I absolutely concur with that, especially when it comes to the Australian landscape and the setting of the bushfires. They're just rendered in incredible detail through her lyrical prose.
And this is a book I need to read on your recommendation. I somehow I think it's been recommended to me by 2 or 3 people now. I need to really get on it. I might need to be making a local bookshop order when we finish recording. But I really like the idea of the short stories of microfiction as well in Outcome 1 for Unit 1, looking at reading and creating. It's got the potential, I imagine, then to be used as a text that students can respond to creatively as well, in terms of playing around with that form. Again, I book listed years ago before it was on the VCE literature list, Foreign Soil, Maxine Beneba Clark's work, and this has turned into a Maxine Beneba Clark advert. But it is a short story collection, and I think short story collections work brilliantly with year 11s because it gives you a lot of flexibility in how you engage them with the form, and like you said, you can curate your own list of stories for them to read. Fantastic. And we've got one last recommendation here. I've been raving about this book all year as well, so our listeners have probably heard about this before. The Coconut Children by Vivian Fan. Another Australian debut novel published in 2020. I'm so, I think, sad for so many wonderful authors who are publishing their first works this year and don't have the opportunity to get out around the country and tour writers' festivals to promote them. This book has a hugely engaging voice, again, a really important characteristic, I think, in text selection. Looks at, I guess, a whole range of complex issues around contemporary Australian identity. Could fit in either Unit 1 or 2, I think. You could find a text quite easily to match it with and compare it with a range of films. I can think of Australian films that would sit nicely with this text. Again, some elements of magic realism in this text as well. lots of distinct narrative voice to discuss, the characters that are engaging with each other, symbolism, also for you to analyze. And yeah, we've talked already about identity, family, grief, a lot of the similar sort of themes that have sat in some of these other texts and that I think engage young people quite readily.
Exactly. And Vivian actually came to speak, or, via Zoom, spoke to some of my students last term, and she was a hugely engaging speaker. Speaker. I'm
Yes,
not a huge
like you and I, yes.
She's really young herself. She wrote this book, I believe, when she was 16 or 17.
That just makes me so sad for myself.
But she was really, the way she engaged with my students, in particular my year nines, was really impressive. So I'd highly recommend getting in touch with her publisher and getting her to speak to student groups as well.
Also a very nice advert there, Karis, at the end. Vate's writing competition, the theme we have for 2021 is Stories That Change. And two of our featured authors for that series will actually be Vivian Fan and Kath Moore, who is the author of Metalfish Falling Snow that I was speaking about earlier. And we'll have a third author as well, Ellen Van Nieuwen, a poet and prose author. So it's a really nice complement of authors who are going to take part in the teaching and learning package for that series. A little nice advert that we didn't pre-plan.
No.
All right, we're going to finish by talking about independent text study, and hopefully our viewers have heard us talk about this before, but we wanted to put a little plug in here again, particularly for those of you working in the 7 to 9 space is where I think this fits best. Why do we like independent text study, Karis?
You and I are big advocates of independent text study. I mean, I think it is pretty self-explanatory, but anecdotally from my experience, the kids are so much more engaged when they are not forced to read something. They get to have their own choice. And I've actually seen it work really successfully at my school, Paran High School, where it's an independent text study, but the teacher actually says an overarching theme. So this term we're doing books about growing up. So they can choose any book they like under the theme of growing up. In term 1, we did one under the theme of love. And, most books can fit under the theme of love or growing up. But that curates it quite nicely as well. But yeah, independent text study, I am a huge fan of.
And we've spoken at length about ways you can set some parameters around this. You've obviously just talked about the success at Paran around a thematic independent text study. Vate's put together some professional learning around this as well, around different ways you can design assessment, so that you're still able to teach skills explicitly, you're still able to work with young people around this. I think, Karis has already hit on the engagement factor. I think also for me, a big selling point is the differentiation factor. One of the difficulties with setting a text, obviously, for a text study is that you've got to find something that has that low floor and high ceiling so that all your learners can engage with the text. And I think this makes it very easy to do that because young people can choose a text that meets them at their point of interest and also their point of need. It also allows you to have a really rich partnership with your school library, but also to reach out and have young people reach out to their local libraries as well, which, Karis and I are big fans of. So if you're interested in this idea, you certainly can have a look at the Vate online professional learning, which we put together around independent text study as well, if that's something that you might want to consider for 2021 or perhaps 2022 if you want to have some time to lead into that. And certainly I'm happy to answer any questions on that topic if you have some. Well, Karis, we've come to the end of our mammoth session. How long do you think we've been recording for? I'm kind of scared to find out. Let me have a look. I think it's about 50 minutes. I'm just going to put that out there. But we had a lot to say. We care a lot about text choice.
As we said, it's something really important and something that should be a really considered process. So we hope that we've inspired all the viewers to really think about their text selection for next year or years beyond.
Absolutely. If we've caught you too late for 2021, then hopefully we've sparked some thought for 2022. Who knows what these years will hold. So you might as well just read some really engaging books and think about the possibilities for working with young people around those texts. Thank you so much, Karis, for your time today. We really appreciate having you as part of the Vate team. And I'd encourage all of our viewers and listeners today to stay tuned for some announcements coming very soon about some more work that Karis and I will be doing together over the coming month or two.